You just said hello to Twitter. So, a couple notes before we get started. The first is that normally I read for 5 or 10 minutes and then I take 40 minutes of questions. But tonight we're going to invert that, and I'm going to read a little bit longer, maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then take a few less questions, just because I think it's fun to have story time. The first time I ever got up and did a reading in front of a pretty crowded room was for my first book, Heart-Shaped Box. And I was pretty nervous. I had dry mouth, my legs were shaky, and I was trying to think of how I could get over my nervousness. And, the book had some pretty salty portions of it. And I decided I was going to read one of those parts. And, the story is about, in part, the relationship between a heavy metal musician and his younger sort of groupie girlfriend. And when we meet them, they're on the rocks. Things aren't going too well. And I started reading from this chapter, and I'm like, I'm just going to go for it. So they're arguing, and she says, "You're a sympathetic son of a bitch, you know that?" And he says, "You want sympathy? Go fuck James Taylor!" As soon as I read that portion of the book, 3 little kids popped up in the crowd. I mean, the oldest of them couldn't have been more than 9, and they were like... And their parents were holding their hands like... So where I'm going with this is a fairly R-rated reading. This is one of the filthier portions of the book, and I can't be on the hook for your bad parenting. So I can't imagine what sort of careless, reckless, second-rate parent would bring a 10-year-old to, my kids are here tonight, they're in the back. My 10-year-old watched some early footage of horns and turned to me after it was done and said, "Are you sure it's not called porns?" So I'm going to read a section from the new novel. I'm going to read a section from Nosferatu. The title is NOS 4A2, which is the bad guy's vanity license plate. The bad guy is a fellow named Charles Talent Manx III, who drives a 1938 Rolls-Royce Wraith that runs on human souls instead of gasoline. And the section I'm going to read, this is a chapter from the middle of the book, but also kind of works as a standalone story. So without further ado, we'll just go for it. St. Luke's Medical Center, Denver. When someone interesting was dead, Hicks always took a picture with them. There had been a local news anchor, a pretty 32-year-old with splendid white blonde hair and pale blue eyes, who got wasted and choked to death on her own puke. Hicks had slipped into the morgue at 1:00 a.m., pulled her out of her drawer, and sat her up. He got an arm around her and bent down to lap at her nipple while holding out his cell phone to take the shot. He didn't actually lick her, though. That would have been gross. There was a rock star, too, a minor rock star anyway. He was the one in that band that had the hit from the Stallone movie. The rock star wasted out from cancer and in death looked like a withered old woman with his feathery brown hair and long eyelashes and wide, somehow feminine lips. Hicks got him out of the drawer and bent his hand into devil's horns and then leaned in and threw the horns himself, snapped a shot of them hanging out together. The rock star's eyelids sagged, so he looked sleepy and cool. Hicks' girlfriend, Sasha, was the one who told him there was a famous serial killer down in the morgue. Sasha was a nurse in pediatrics 8 floors up. She loved his photos with famous dead people. She was always the first person he emailed them to. Sasha thought Hicks was hilarious. She said he ought to be on The Daily Show. Hicks was fond of Sasha, too. She had a key to the pharmacy locker, and Saturday night she'd filch them something good, a little Oxy or some medical-grade Coke, and on breaks they'd find an empty delivery room, and she'd shimmy out of the bottoms of her loose nurse jammies and climb up into the stirrups. Hicks had never heard of the guy, so Sasha used the computer in the nurse's station to pull up a news story about him. The mugshot was bad enough. A bald guy with a narrow face and a mouthful of sharp, crooked teeth. His eyes were bright and round and stupid in their hollow sockets. The caption identified him as Charles Talent Manx, sent to the federal pen more than a decade before for burning some sorry motherfucker to death in front of a dozen witnesses. It's not any big deal, Hicks said. He just killed one dude. He's worse than John Wayne Stacy. He killed like all kinds of kids. All kinds. He had a house where he did it. He hung little angels in the trees for every one he cut up. It's awesome. It's like creepy symbolism. Little Christmas angels. They called the place the sleigh house. Get it? Do you get it, Hicks? No. Like he slayed him there, but also like Santa's sleigh? Do you get it now? She said. No. He didn't see what Santa had to do with a guy like Manx. The house got burnt down, but the ornaments are still there, hanging in the trees like a memorial. She tugged at the drawstring of her scrubs. Serial killers get me hot. All I can think about is all the nasty shit I do to keep him from killing me. You go take a pic with him and email it to me. And, tell me what you're going to do if I don't get naked for you. He didn't see any reason to argue with that kind of logic. And he had to make his rounds anyway. Besides, if the guy had killed lots of people, it might be worth taking a pic to add to his collection. Hicks had already done several funny photographs, but he felt it would be good to have a snap with the serial killer to demonstrate his darker, more serious side. In the elevator alone, Hicks drew his gun on his own reflection and said, "Either this is going in your mouth or my big cock is," practicing his lines for Sasha. It was all good till his walkie-talkie went off, and his uncle said, "Hey, dumbass, keep playing with that gun. Maybe you'll shoot yourself and we can hire someone who can actually do this fucking job." He had forgotten there was a camera in the elevator. Fortunately, there was no hidden microphone. Hicks pushed his .38 back into the holster and lowered his head, hoping the brim of his hat hit his face. He took 10 seconds, fighting with his anger and embarrassment, then pressed the talk button on his walkie, meaning to snap off something really fucking harsh, shut the old turd up for once. But instead, all he managed was copy that and a pinched little squeak that he hated. His Uncle Jim had gotten him the security job. Glossing over Hicks's early departure from high school and the arrest for public drunkenness, Hicks had been at the hospital for only 2 months and had been cited twice already, once for tardiness, once for not responding to his walkie. At the time, it had been his turn in the stirrups. His Uncle Jim had already said if there was a third citation before he had a full year under his belt, they'd have to let him go. His Uncle Jim had a spotless record, probably because all he had to do was sit in a security office for 6 hours a day and watch the monitors with one eye while perusing Skinamax with the other. 30 years of watching TV for $14 an hour and full benefits. That was what Hicks was angling for. But if he lost the security job, if he got cited again, he might have to go back to McDonald's. That would be bad. When he had signed on at the hospital, he had given up the glamour job at the drive-through window, and he loathed the idea of starting from the bottom rung again. Even worse, it would probably be the end of Sasha and Sasha's key to the pharmacy locker and all the fun they had taking turns in the stirrups. Sasha liked Hicks's uniform. He didn't think she'd feel the same way about a McDonald's getup. Hicks reached basement level 1 and slouched out. When the elevator doors were closed, he turned back, grabbed his crotch, and blew a wet kiss at them. "Suck my balls, you homosexual fat ass," he said. "I bet you'd like that." There wasn't a lot of action in the basement at 11:30 at night. Most of the lights were off, except for one bank of overhead fluorescents every 50 feet, one of the hospital's new austerity measures. The only foot traffic was the occasional person wandering in from the parking lot across the street by way of an underground tunnel. Hicks's prized possession was parked over there, a black Trans Am with zebra upholstery and blue neon lights set in the undercarriage, so when it roared down the road, it looked like a UFO right out of E.T. Something else he'd have to give up if he lost this job. No way he could make the payment flipping burgers. Sasha loved to fuck him in the Trans Am. She was crazy for animals, and the faux zebra seat covers brought out her wild side. Hicks thought the serial killer would be in the morgue, but it turned out he was already in the autopsy theater. One of the docs had started in on him, then abandoned him there to finish tomorrow. Hicks flipped on the lights over the tables, but left the rest of the room in darkness. He pulled the curtain across the window and the door. There was no bolt, but he pushed the chalk in under the door as far as it would go to make it impossible for anyone to wander in casually. Whoever had been working on Charlie Manx had covered him with a sheet before going. He was the only body in the theater tonight, his gurney parked under a plaque that said, Hic locus est ubi mors, gaude circulae vitae. Someday Hicks was going to Google that one, find out what the hell it meant. He snapped the sheet down to Manx's ankles, had himself a look. The chest had been sawed open, then stitched back together with coarse black thread. It was a Y-shaped cut and extended all the way down to the pelvic bone. Charlie Manx's wang was as long and skinny as a Hebrew national. He had a ghastly overbite, so his crooked brown teeth stuck out into his lower lip. His eyes were open, and he seemed to be staring at Hicks with a kind of blank fascination. Hicks didn't like that much. He had seen his share of debtors, but they usually had their eyes closed. And if their eyes weren't closed, there was a kind of milky look to them, as if something in them had curdled. Life itself, perhaps. But these eyes seemed bright and alert, the eyes of the living, not the dead. They had in them an avid, bird-like curiosity. No, Hicks didn't care for that at all. For the most part, however, Hicks had no anxieties about the dead. He wasn't scared of the dark, either. He was a little scared of Uncle Jim, and he worried about Sasha poking a finger up his ass, something she insisted he would like. And he had recurring nightmares about finding himself at work with no pants on, wandering the halls with his cock slapping between his thighs, people turning to stare. That was about it for fears and phobias. He wasn't sure why they hadn't put Manx back in his drawer, because it looked like they were done with the chest cavity. But when Hicks got him sat up, he propped him against the wall with his long, skinny hands in his lap. He saw a dotted line curving around the back of his skull, drawn in Sharpie. Right. Hicks had seen in Sasha's newspaper article that Manx had been in and out of a coma for more than a decade, so naturally the docs would want to poke around in his head. Besides, who didn't want to peek at a serial killer's brain? There was probably a medical paper in that. The autopsy tools, the saw, the forceps, the rib cutters, the bone mallet, were on a wheeled steel tray by the corpse. At first, Hicks thought he'd give Manx the scalpel, which looked pretty serial killerish, but it was too small. He could tell just by looking at it, it wouldn't show up good in the pictures he snapped with his shitty camera phone. The bone mallet was a different story. It was a big silver hammer with a head shaped like a brick, but pointed at one end, the back edge as sharp as a meat cleaver. At the other end of the handle was a hook, what they used to dig under the edge of the skull and pull it off like a cap from a bottle. The bone mallet was hardcore. Hicks took a minute to fit it into Manx's hand. He pulled a face at the sight of Manx's nasty long fingernails, split at the ends and as yellow as the guy's fucking teeth. He looked like that actor from the Alien movie, Lance Henriksen, if someone had shaved Henriksen's head, then smashed him a couple times with the ugly stick. Manx also had thin, pinkish-white, saggy tits that reminded Hicks horribly of what his own mother had under her bra. Hicks picked out the bone saw for himself and stuck an arm around Manx's shoulders. Manx sagged, his big bald head resting against Hicks's chest. That was all right. Now they looked like drinking buddies who had had a few. Hicks dug his cell phone from its holster and held it out from his body. He narrowed his eyes, struck a menacing grimace, and took the shot. He lowered the corpse and glanced at the phone. It wasn't a great picture. Hicks had wanted to look dangerous, but the pained expression on his face suggested that Sasha had finally wiggled her pinky up his ass after all. He was thinking about reshooting when he heard loud voices right outside the autopsy room's door. For one terrible moment, he thought the first voice belonged to his Uncle Jim. Ah, that little bastard is in for it. He has no idea. Hicks flung a sheet over the body, his heart going off like someone speed shooting a Glock. Those voices had hitched up right beyond the door, and he was sure they were about to start pushing to come in. He walked halfway to the door to pull out the chalk when he realized he was still holding the bone saw. He set it on the tool cart with a shaking hand. He was already recovering by the time he paced back to the door. A second man was laughing, and the first was speaking again. "Have all 4 molars yanked. They'll gas him out with the sevoflurane, and when they smash the teeth, he won't feel a thing. But when he wakes up, he's going to feel like he got fucked in the mouth with a shovel." Hicks didn't know who was having his teeth removed, but once he heard a little more of the voice, he could tell that it wasn't his Uncle Jim out in the hall, just some old bastard with a creaky old bastard voice. He waited until he heard the 2 men walk away before he bent to pull the chalk free. He counted to 5, then slipped out. Hicks needed a drink of water and to wash his hands. He felt a little trembly. He took a long, soothing stroll, breathing deeply. When he finally reached the men's room, he didn't just need a drink. He needed to unload his bowels. Hicks took the handicap stall for the extra leg room. While he was parked there, dropping bombs, he emailed Sasha the photo of him and Manx together and wrote, "Bend over and drop your pants. Daddy is coming with Tessa. If you don't do what I say, you crazy bitch. Wait for me in the room of punishment." By the time he was leaning over the sink, slurping noisily at the water, Hicks had begun to have worrisome thoughts. He had been so rattled by the sound of voices in the hallway that he could not remember if he had left the body the way he'd found it. Worse, he had a terrible idea he had left the bone mallet in Charlie Manx's hand. If it was found there in the morning, some smart-ass doc would probably want to know why, and it was a safe bet that Uncle Jim would grill the entire staff. Hicks didn't know if he could handle that kind of pressure. He decided to wander back to the autopsy theater and make sure he had cleaned up properly. He paused outside the door to peek through the window, only to discover he had left the curtains drawn. That was one thing to fix right there. Hicks eased the door in and frowned. In his haste to get out of the autopsy theater, he had switched all the lights off, not just the lights over the gurneys, but also the safety lights that were always on in the corners of the room and over the desk. The room smelled of iodine and benzaldehyde. Easier to type than to write, than to pronounce. Hicks let the door sigh shut behind him and stood isolate in the darkness. He was running his hand across the tiled wall, feeling for the light switches, when he heard the squeak of a wheel in the dark and the gentle clink of metal on metal. Hicks caught himself and listened, and in the next moment felt someone rushing across the room at him. It was not a sound or anything he could see. It was something he felt on his skin and a sense in his eardrums, like a change in pressure. His stomach went watery and sick. He had reached out with his right hand for the light switch. Now he dropped the hand, feeling for the .38. He had it part way out when he heard something whistling at him in the darkness, and he was struck in the stomach with what felt like an aluminum baseball bat. He doubled over with a woofing sound. The gun sank back into the holster. The club went away and came back. It caught Hicks in the left side of the head, above his ear, spun him on his heel, and dropped him. He fell straight back out of plane and down through frozen night sky, falling, and try as hard as he could to scream, he made not a sound. All the air in his lungs pounded right out of him. When Ernest Hicks opened his eyes, there was a man bent over him, smiling shyly. Hicks opened his mouth to ask what had happened, and then the pain flooded into his head, and he turned his face and puked all over the guy's black loafers. His stomach pumped up his dinner, General Tso's chicken, in a pungent gush. "I'm so sorry, man," Hicks said when he was done heaving. "It's okay, son," the doc said. "Don't try to stand. We're going to take you up to the ER. You've suffered a concussion. I want to make sure you don't have a skull fracture." But it was coming back to Hicks what had happened, the man in the dark hitting him with the metal bludgeon. "What the fuck?" he cried. "What the fuck? Is my gun? Anyone see my gun?" The doc, his tag said Sofer, put a hand on Hicks's chest to prevent him from sitting up. "I think that one's gone, son," said Sofer. "Don't try and get up, Ernie," said Sasha, standing 3 feet away and staring at him with a look of something approximating horror on her face. There were a couple of other nurses standing with her, all of them looking pale and strained. "Oh, God. Oh, my God. They stole my .38. Did they grab anything else?" Just your pants, said Sopher. Just my, what? Fucking what? Hicks twisted his head to look and saw he was bare naked from the waist down, his cock out for the doc and Sasha and the other nurses to look at. Hicks thought he might vomit again. It was like the bad dream he got sometimes, the one about showing up at work with no pants on, everyone staring at him. He had the sudden wrenching idea that the sick fuck who had ripped his pants off had maybe poked a finger up his asshole like Sasha was always threatening to do. Did he touch me? Did he fucking touch me? We don't know, the doctor said. Probably not. He probably just didn't want you to get up and chase him and figured you wouldn't run after him if you were naked. It's very possible he only took your gun because it was in your holster on your belt. Although the guy hadn't taken his shirt. He had grabbed Hicks's windbreaker, but not his shirt. Hicks began to cry. He farted, a wet, whistling blat. He had never felt so miserable. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. What the fuck is wrong with people? Hicks cried. Dr. Sopher shook his head. Who knows what the guy was thinking? Maybe he was hopped up on something. Maybe he's just some sick creep who wanted a one-of-a-kind trophy. Let the cops worry about that. I just want to focus on you. Trophy! Hicks cried, imagining his pants hung up on a wall in a picture frame. Yeah, I guess, Doc Sopher said, glancing over his shoulder across the room. Only reason I can think why someone would want to come in here and steal the body of a famous serial killer. Hicks turned his head. A gong went off in his brain and filled his skull with dark reverberations, and saw that the gurney had been rolled halfway across the room and that someone had yanked the dead body right off it. He moaned again and shut his eyes. He heard the rapid clip-clop of boot heels coming down the hallway and thought he recognized the goose-stepping gait of his Uncle Jim on the march, out from behind his desk and not happy about it. There was no logical reason to fear the man. Hicks was the victim here. He had been assaulted, for Christ's sake. But alone and miserable in his only refuge, the dark behind his eyelids, he felt that logic didn't enter into it. His Uncle Jim was coming, and a third citation was coming with him, was about to fall like a silver hammer. Hicks had literally been caught with his pants down, and he saw already that at least in one sense he was never going to be stepping into those security pants again. It was all lost, had been taken away in a moment in the shadows of the autopsy room. The good job, the good days of Sasha and stirrups and treats from the pharmacy locker and funny photos with dead bodies. Even his Trans Am with the zebra upholstery was gone, although no one would know it for hours. The sick fuck who'd clubbed him senseless had helped himself to the keys and driven away in it. Gone. Everything. All of it. Gone off with dead old Charlie Manx and never coming back. The rest of the book is tremendously clean and inoffensive. I can't tell you how my soul has burned to read that part of the book for like a year and a half, you know, but this is the first time that I've had a chance to read the fable of Hicks and Sasha, the legend of Hicks and Sasha. Yeah, that's the Will Ferrell part of the book. So, here's the part where I turn it over to you guys, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have. I'm happy to talk about this book, Nosferatu. We can talk about 20th Century Ghosts, Heart-Shaped Box, the comic, Lock and Key, Craft, Process, Your Love Lives. I'm here for that. If you want relationship advice, I'm your man. Politics. My message to you is I'm here for you all night long, or at least for 20 more minutes. And the other thing that I try to keep in mind is how shy people can be. I've learned people can be very nervous about raising their hand, stepping out on the ledge, and asking that first question. And over time, I've developed a technique for dealing with that. which is if no one asks me questions, I look for someone who seems vulnerable and shy in the crowd. And then I ask them a question, like what's the capital of Guatemala, or who commanded the British Navy in 1814. If you're not confident in your knowledge of world geography or maritime history, one way to defend yourself is to have a little question in your heart and to daringly raise your hand. So with that, I'll ask. Yes, sir?
As a former Colorado resident, I have to wonder how much of Christmas Land is influenced by Santa's workshop outside of Colorado Springs?
So the question is, as a former Colorado resident, how much was the creation of Christmas Land influenced by
Santa's workshop outside of Colorado Springs?
Santa's workshop outside of Colorado Springs? And the fact that I didn't know the name of the place probably indicates the answer. So Charlie Manx has survived for over a century, and the way he's done it is by taking passengers for long rides in his car, and his passengers are usually children, and he drains something essential from them, some life force, and when he's done with them, there's nothing left except fangs and happiness. The kids have a terrific sense of fun, and they enjoy whatever they're doing, whether it's a game of tag or stabbing a homeless man to death with a pair of scissors. They've invented a game called Scissors for the Drifter, which has given them a great pleasure over the decades. And they never get any older. And he drops them off in a place that isn't really in our world, a place called Christmas Land, this kind of nightmarish amusement park where every morning is Christmas morning and every evening is Christmas Eve. And I was aware that there are a number of amusement parks that have a kind of Santa theme going, and that these were popular in the 50s, and some of them are still around, and none of the rides have been updated, and all like the Santas are all kind of like pea yellow from being out in the environment in the rain and stuff, and they're all sort of scary looking with their big chubby cheeks and these grins that look like they're ready to eat you. So that was a little bit of a little bit of an influence. But the other thing is, Lon Chaney once said that there's nothing funny about a clown at midnight. And I've always felt that almost everything you need to know about horror fiction is encoded in that one sentence. Everyone loves to hear the holiday music on November 21st. Maybe they don't like hearing it on October 21st, which is when it actually gets started. But, holiday music and festival lighting has its place, and we associate it with joy, happiness, and innocence. But as a horror writer, it's my job to subvert those ideas. And, if you're out walking in the woods, and it's a thunderstormy July day, hot and oppressive, and you're all by yourself, and you walk by a decrepit old house with the windows bashed in, and nothing in there except darkness and cobwebs, and you hear Winter Wonderland coming from somewhere inside, you're going to walk faster. So that's basically I try to find something sweet and innocent and ruin it. You had a question, yes, you. Yeah. Yeah.
There was a question asked, he said we should ask you as well, whether you or he would write the scarier Doctor Who episode.
Oh, the question is, the question that Neil, I guess, wanted me to be asked was whether I think that I'd write the scarier Doctor Who episode or he would. I know probably 5% of what Neil Gaiman knows. That guy can write rings around me. I'm sure he's forgotten more about writing than I'll ever know. I think when he wants to turn the fear volume up to 11, that's an easy switch for him to turn, an easy dial for him to reach. So I wouldn't want to compete with Neil in any way whatsoever. And besides, I kind of feel like we play for the same team, that we both have the same ideas about the possibility that genre fiction can have the pleasures of mainstream fiction, that genre fiction can be light on its feet and funny and also say something about, big subjects like death and childhood and relationships he's like the world's sweetest guy, and I don't know anyone who spends any time with him at all who doesn't wind up completely, falling in love with him. I'd love to see Neil do another Doctor Who episode that's really, really nasty and scary. That'd be great. A lot of fun. Way in the back.
This is a lock and key question.
Okay.
Did you have any ideas for keys that you rejected or couldn't fit into the story?
So the question is, it's a lock and key question. Did I have any ideas for keys that didn't fit into the story? Maybe I better go back and explain what lock and key is about before I answer the question. Lock and key is I was a comic book writer before I was a novelist, and lock and key is sort of my dream project. One of my inspirations growing up, one of my key inspirations was Neil Gaiman, and also Alan Moore, and both of these guys had long, moving, challenging, exciting runs on comic book titles. Neil had Sandman, which is kind of like Lord of the Rings for comic books. I mean, it's that big. It is the Lord of the Rings of the comic book world. And Alan Moore had Swamp Thing, which I think is the best horror comic of all time, and just does amazing things with character. And I really wanted to have that. I really wanted to see if I could do it, if I could write a comic that went for years and had many stories. And I conceived I wound up on the basis of one short story, doing a Spider-Man story. I wrote one short story that caught the attention of a talent scout at Marvel Comics. She invited me to write for Spider-Man. I did it. It was a terrible story. I totally choked. But it excited me, and I couldn't wait to write more for comics. So I worked up a bunch of pitches, including, I remember one was for Baby Hulk, because I had a 2-year-old, I had a toddler at the time, and when he had a tantrum, they were so frightening. He'd scream and rage, and then he'd pick up a plastic truck and throw it at you, and it would hit you. And I remember thinking, what if he could pick up a real truck? I should add that Baby Hulk never went anywhere. I also had an idea for a story about a haunted New England mansion that was full of unlikely and impossible keys. And every key would open a different door, and activate a different power. So there would be one key that would that would open a ghost door, and if you walked through it, your body would fall dead, and your spirit would move on without you. There'd be another door that would turn a boy into a girl and a girl into a boy. There'd be a key called the Anywhere key you could put into a door and turn it, and imagine where you wanted to go and open the door and step out in Paris or New York City or Tokyo. And even after Marvel passed on that story and DC passed on that story, I continued to think about it. I'd go on late night drives for diapers, and it would be in my head, new keys, I started to see the characters and stuff. A couple years later, my book of short stories came out, and IDW Comics got in touch with me about adapting some of the short stories for comic books. That was something they had started to do with cult writers known for their short stories like Cory Doctorow, and they wanted to do the same with me because there was some good buzz around the collection. And I said, wait, no, I got something even better for you. And I pitched them Lock and Key, and I said, I can tell the whole story in 6 issues, and they bought that shit. It's been 5 years since then, and we're just finishing the series now after almost 40 issues. So I overshot it by a little bit. I have used a lot of keys that I originally conceived. There was one key that I imagined using for a story about how Tyler wound up sleeping with his ethics teacher. And in that story, he was going to use a key that would make him an older, it was an age key, and when he turned the key and walked through the door, he'd be in his late 30s. And his ethics teacher is none of this is in the comic. This was all sort of backstory that I worked out that does not appear in a single panel it does actually appear in one panel. But his ethics teacher is a wonderful woman, but is very troubled about the death of her son in Afghanistan, and is looking for something. And I thought this would be an interesting way to tackle the subject of teachers having sex with their students. But there was never really room to squeeze that story in, and it never really felt essential. So I never got to use the age key. So that would be one key that never found its way into the stories. I got to tell another story here before I answer another question that has absolutely nothing to do with anything. But it's about going to buy diapers at 2 in the morning. I didn't realize how little sleep you get when you have babies, because you don't sleep for like years. And I was always walking around in this kind of shell-shocked daze where the lights were a little too bright, had halos around them, and noises were a little too loud, and I would be talking to myself and not aware of it. And I remember going for a diaper run to Walgreens at 11 in the evening, and I got in there, and I was walking around, and a recorded voice said, "Today we have a sale on lunch meats. 50% off on lunch meats, all select lunch meats." And I just thought that word was so funny, lunch meats. So I was like walking around the Walgreens going, lunch meat? Lunch meat? And I walked around a corner saying this and bumped into this young woman. And I'm like walking around the corner going, lunch meat? Oh my God, I'm so sorry. And like she was shocked, as you would be if a strange man shouted lunch meat in your face in the middle of a Walgreens. I got my diapers and I got the fuck out of there. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so upset. And I jumped in the red car and slammed the door and I'm like, God, thank God I got out of there. And I mean, that was so embarrassing. And I put the keys in the car and it's funny because the car wasn't starting. And then I thought, oh my God, I didn't come in the red car. I came in my wife's silver car. And suddenly I see the whole picture in my mind. I'm in her car and she's going to come out and she's going to be like telling the police, she's like, First he was talking about his lunch meat in the store, and then he was waiting for me in the car. I'm going to do 6 years in fucking jail just because I'm tired. I leapt out of the car. I got home. The lunch meat lady never spotted me. Everything was cool. It was no big deal. But I just want to say, no matter how tired you are, just try to keep it inside and know which car you're getting into. Yes, sir. That's very nice to say. That's very kind. He says I should read the audiobooks. But there are dudes who have amazing voices, actors, and it's amazing how much better they are at reading this stuff than I am. The Nosferatu was read by Kate Mulgrew. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she was astonishing. She just brings so much game. She got so much game. She brings so much game to the reading. Heart-Shaped Box was read by the actor Stephen Lang, who you might remember from Avatar. At one point, his arm got on fire, and he's like, Stephen Lang is awesome. And now I kind of feel like if I write a story that's largely from a male point of view, I want Stephen Lang to read it. And if I write a story from a female point of view, I want Kate Mulgrew to read it because they're just so good and I can't even come close to matching what they can do. The new book has some large sections from a female point of view and some large sections from a male point of view, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to have the two of them take turns. So we'll see. That's still in the early going. Yeah, go ahead. Do I find it difficult to write from a female perspective? My first published book was a book of short stories called 20th Century Ghosts. A lot of people think it's my second book, but it actually came out, it was published by a small press in England about 2 years before my first novel, Heart-Shaped Box. But it was only published as a small, limited thing, and so it wasn't widely published until after Heart-Shaped Box. There are 15 stories in 20th Century Ghosts, and every single one has a male protagonist. Heart-Shaped Box has a male protagonist, and Horns has a male protagonist. And I know when I went into Nosferatu, I was thinking my whole career was starting to look like one big sausage party. And so with that in mind, I very much wanted to write a female lead. I also wanted to write about parenting, which is something I've done for the last 14 years now. And I think that while the boogeyman and the monster are scary, being a parent is terrifying because the world is full of knives and there are so many ways for your kids to get cut, and there is only so much you can do to protect them. They're going to get cut whether you like it or not. They're going to go out and get hurt. And thinking of all the ways they can be damaged or broken is terrifying. I wanted to explore that, and I wanted to write about a woman, so I wound up writing about this woman, Vic McQueen, who is a loving but reluctant mother. And I also noticed that, especially in genre fiction, a lot of mothers show up to like bake muffins and dispense wisdom, and I find that very tiresome. So I wanted to write about someone who maybe never pictured herself being a mother, and who's an artist and has artistic ambitions. Someone who has regrets and angers, someone who is in love with a guy but isn't sure she really wants to be with him. I really wanted to look at this woman's life on a big canvas and not let her just be confined to one sort of neat cubbyhole. And it did take me about 600 pages to do that well. Over the course of the novel, but I noticed that the new book largely has a female lead. It does go back and forth between perspective, and I've also got a book in the works called Gunpowder, which opens with a female lead for the first 100 pages. So maybe the next 3 books will all take off from a woman's point of view. We'll have to see. Yeah, you. How long have I been writing for? I made my first professional fiction submission at 12 years old. There was a book called the Marvel Tryout Book that had a Spider-Man story in it. You probably noticed Spidey is a running theme with me. It had half a Spider-Man comic in it, and then if you were an artist, you were supposed to draw the end. And if you were a colorist, you had some uncolored pages to color. And if you were a writer, you were supposed to write how you wanted it to wrap up. I wrote a perfectly brilliant conclusion to the comic and sent it to Marvel Comics. I was surprised by a form rejection. But written across the bottom of it was a little note from Jim Shooter, who was at the time the editor-in-chief. And I couldn't read it. It was completely indecipherable. It might have said, "Hang it up, maggot." But I thought it probably meant next time. And so I assumed that shortly I would be writing for Spider-Man, and I was correct in that. I nailed that gig just 26 years later. I have both my parents write. My dad's written a few books. He's done some interesting genre work, and I feel like he shows promise, and if he sticks at it, he might have a future in this business. Both my parents write. My mother is also a novelist, a remarkable novelist, Tabitha King, whose first book was Small World, and she wrote a whole string of great books afterwards, One-on-One, Book of Reuben, Survivor. My mom is here tonight. My mom, in many ways, is also the editor-in-chief of the Hill King Corporation. I sent her Nosferatu, and I won't ruin the ending of the book, but I will say that the original ending, was a bitter, ugly, nasty thing, and I knew it was a masterpiece. And all my artistic integrity was wedded to keeping this thumb in the eye of the reader, right up until my mom read the book. And then she said, "Joe, this is a really wonderful book, but these last 15 pages just won't do." And I was like, "Okay, Mom." So I wrote a new ending. So my parents were people and are people who write every day, who think about story all the time. And so by the time I was 12, I was writing every day, and I wrote a whole mess of novels in high school. So and in spite of all that work, it still really took me until my mid-30s to break through. I wrote book after book that was rejected. I spent 3 years on an epic fantasy novel, this immense 700-page thing, and I really felt that I would be fighting off offers. And instead it was turned down by every publisher in New York and every publisher in England, and for an extra kick in the shins was turned down in Canada. And so it goes. So, and the reason it was turned down was because it wasn't good enough. I take, yeah, I'll take one or two more. I don't want to, because I know that we have to, it's 8 now. I'll take one or two more. Maybe we'll even start to shift into a speed round while I answer questions just faster. And then, because I know we have to do a signing and some other stuff. Go ahead, sir.
Since I have this opportunity, I asked your father this a few years ago.
Yeah.
What frightened you as a boy?
Aside from what?
Besides the parenting.
Yeah. What frightens me as a writer? YouTube, because there are so many things that on YouTube that people could be looking at instead of reading like the book. And I'm always afraid people read like 2 pages and go, "Oh, this looks like a lot of work." I hear there's new cat videos online, and right on. So I'm scared of being bored. That's a big worry. I do love YouTube, though. My girlfriend and I, we went to go see a movie called The Apparition, which didn't quite nourish my soul like I hoped it would. And afterwards, we got online and we started looking for ghosts on YouTube, like ghost footage. Because my feeling is if science hasn't proved the afterlife is real, it's just because they haven't spent enough time looking on YouTube, And I was convinced if we stayed on long enough, if we looked at enough videos, eventually we would find something and, we didn't actually. Yes, ma'am.
One other question that was asked in the event that I think actually should be asked of all authors: if you were a god, what would you be the god of?
I'd be a fucking god of metal. If I could be a god, I'd be the god of metal. Someday, I just want to get metal enough so someday I can show up to like a reading with like a big death's head belt buckle on. Because that would be cool. Sometimes I think I like things like tea and reading too much to be really metal. Do you get to... Say again?
I said that could be brutal.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I mean, do you get to be metal if you like tea and Doctor Who? I don't know. You think so? A few people are nodding. Maybe you do get to be metal. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry. You're next. You're next. Go ahead.
Why did you decide to leave Hicks alive at the end of that story?
Why did I decide to leave Hicks? Because I thought life was worse.
What are you reading?
What am I reading right now? I'm reading a couple things. I'm reading a book of short stories by Karen Russell called Vampires in the Lemon Grove, which is a really cool book, especially for one short story called The Seagull Army Descends on Strong Beach, 1976, which is about this incredible flock of seagulls showing up on this beach in 1976, and it turns out that they're picking objects. They've got a nest, a big, huge nest, and there are things in the nest from the future and things from the past, and they're like picking stuff like it's 1976, and like this kid discovers the nest, he discovers a penny from 1981, and like it's just a really, really cool story. That's a great story. And I'm also reading a book called Let the Right One In. I have to say, I've seen the film. Of my 5 favorite films, one is Let the Right One In, and the other 4 were all directed by the same guy. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any chance that the search engine series will ever show up in our world?
Vic McQueen does a series called Search Engine, which is kind of like Where's Waldo crossed with a series of Escher paintings. She's a children's book illustrator, and this is how she makes her money in Nosferatu. I'm doing a comic book called Wraith, which is an early story of Charlie Manx in Christmasland. And we've talked about, Gabe and I have talked, Gabriel Rodriguez is my collaborator on Lock and Key, and Gabe is not drawing Wraith. It's being drawn by the very talented Charles Wilson III. I think it's funny, he's Charles Wilson III, and it's Charlie Manx III, so in the comic credits, he's Charles Talent Wilson III. But there might be some search engine pages in the back of the Wraith comic. I'll take one more, and then we've got to be done, so we can just give everyone time to sign. Yes, sir.
Well, 2 things. One's a little quickie. How did you come up with the idea for the head key in Lock and Key? Such an amazing concept. And also, a second note, who's that director who directed the other 4 great movies?
The question is, how did I come up with the concept of the head key? in Lock and Key. It's a sort of a favorite key of a lot of people. And also who the director is. Director is Steven Spielberg. I've never really made it past my cultural understanding ends at 1989. So it's like Close Encounters, Jaws, E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I mean, there actually hasn't been anything good in music since Whitesnake Slip It In. But you guys knew that, so that's not like, what's funny is my mom spoke to the Clarion West class this morning, and she said I had a Farrah Fawcett poster on my wall. I didn't, actually. It was a Lita Ford poster. Because Lita Ford is awesome. As far as the head key goes, the head key is a key you can put into the back of your head. When you get it close to your neck, a keyhole appears, and you can stick it in your neck and turn it, and your head opens, and inside you can see the inner landscape of all all the things you can imagine and remember, all your hopes, phone numbers, toys, things you've read. And I like that because I like the idea of having a book and you don't have time to read it, but you can unlock your head and go, and just cram it in there, and then you'd have read something in a minute instead of reading it in like a week. And that's probably where the idea came from. But after a while, I came to realize that, in fact, that would be a really unsatisfying way to read a book, if you could do it. And so there's kind of some drawbacks to the head key. There's a 15-year-old girl in the story who has been traumatized, and she doesn't want to be scared anymore, and she doesn't want to cry anymore. So she opens her head with the head key and takes out her fear and her tears. Her fear is this nasty little goblin who screams things like, "You look ugly naked!" And her tears is this thing called the weepy that's just like, "No one ever lied to me." And she sticks him in a Coke bottle and sets it aside, and then she's not afraid anymore, and she never cries, never makes her. It doesn't work out. I don't really know where. Probably I got it going to buy lunch meat at Walgreens at one of them. I want to say one more thing. There's Nosferatu is a big book, and there are several people in the book who have talismanic objects, which they can use to open up fantastic powers. Vic McQueen has a motorcycle which he can use to bend reality. Charlie Manx has his 1938 Rolls Royce, which he can use to bend reality. There is also a character named Margaret Leigh in the story. Maggie is a punk rock librarian. She kind of looks like a character out of a Dashiell Hammett novel, if like Sam Spade fronted a ska band. And she also has this thing which can bend reality. She has a bag of Scrabble tiles, and it's bottomless, and she can reach into it. When she pulls out the Scrabble tiles and throws them down, after she rearranges the letters, she can spell secrets. She's one of my. I like Maggie quite a bit. And I also think that libraries are the place you go to get objects that really do bend reality and open up impossible escapes, and those are books. Everyone who works at this library is doing the true work of the Lord. This is the only one true church, in my opinion. You don't have to feel the same, but do yourself a favor and support the Seattle Public Library, and keep your card active and keep the books flying out. So, guys, thanks so much. I'm going to go scribble on books.